In September 2016, I had the opportunity to enroll for a doctoral degree in higher education management at Prof. As we are speaking, Prof is closed and nobody is allowed on campus, and they can't even say when it will reopen. So they are also struggling with a lot of the issues that they are dealing with. I just saw that there was 15,000 new cases in UK last night, so they are having a second wave. But by doing this doctoral provided me with a unique opportunity to take a few steps back from my own role in management and look at it through an academic lens. And this came at an opportune time when we faced issues of decolonization, outsourcing, free education. It was really a time of radical change. In my research, I focused specifically on leadership. And I learned that although leadership skills might be generic, the higher education context poses unique challenges. So the question that I want to explore during this session is, how do leaders maintain legitimacy during institutional radical change? Because of the time constraints and the risk of information overload, I briefly want to touch on the different theories that I used as lenses to study leadership legitimacy. And then I want to focus on the results. I want to start by introducing institutional theory. And what do we mean when we say universities are highly institutionalized organizations? Then I want to explain change by referring to the Kinevin Framework as a categorization framework for change, the meaning of legitimacy and sense-making, followed by some findings on leadership legitimacy. If someone were to ask you, describe this organization, this university you are employed at, how would you describe it? The education system represents a highly institutionalized context and has a higher impact on social behavior than many other organizations. In 1852, John Henry Newman, in The Idea of a University, said, a university is a place where the students come from every quarter for every kind of knowledge, a place for the communication and circulation of thought. It's the place to which 1,000 schools make contributions, in which the intellect may safely range and speculate. It's a place where inquiry is pushed forward, discoveries verified, and errors exposed. It's a place of mutual education. And over decades, this notion has been expanded, and more universities were formed. Institutionalization refers to the process through which components of a structure becomes repeated over time, assigned similar meanings, and become widely accepted as appropriate and necessary, and serve to legitimate organizations. From the perspective of new institutionalism, elements of an environment such as culture, symbol, cognitive systems, and normative beliefs define organizations. One such thing about systems, especially systems in institutions, is that people grow unconscious of them. The system gets internalized. It becomes a mindset. It is just the way things are, and it becomes very hard to recover the reasons why it is the way things are. That were the words of Louis Menand. As an example, the association of a university with a physical location has been institutionalized over centuries. After the movement to build structures for university in the 14th century in Europe, the idea of a university as a physical space and place has taken shape and gradually led to many universities being the size of small cities. John Stuart Mill argued that universities should not be places of professional education, as their object is not to make skillful lawyers or physicians or engineers, but rather capable and cultivated human beings. People are citizens before they are lawyers, and if you make them capable and sensible citizens, they will make themselves capable and sensible lawyers. So what graduates should carry away with them from a university is not only professional knowledge, but that which should direct the use of their professional knowledge. The history of universities shows that universities are slow to change and rooted in cultural, economic, and political history. So if we want to conceptualize and explain why institutions, including universities, develop and evolve, We need an analysis of the behavior of the stakeholders who develop and support these institutions. Only then we have an analysis of the context in which institutions have meaning and can function properly. And of course, this must be done all the time, as the context are constantly changing. This is a very interesting book about institutional behavior. Lepsius, in his book Max Weber and Institutional Theory, proposes that institutionalization takes place in a 5-dimensional framework. And in each step, you can think of how you apply these dimensions when you perform your work. First, the development of rationality criteria. Certain values or ideas become behavioral maxims applicable to the different people in the university. And of course, these people have their own motives and interests. So certain social behavior is structured by setting rules and procedures in such a way that the behavior becomes independent of an individual's motivation. As a result, social behavior becomes calculable, predictable, and intersubjectively controllable. These behavioral maxims can be defined as rationality criteria because following them in a given context of action is considered appropriate. Over time, these rules become rational myths, meaning they become taken for granted and are sometimes not even directly associated anymore with the values that led to its formation. Their existence and efficiency go undisputed and in some measure behind the discretion of any individual. You will probably relate to the following example. When a person from the outside joins the university and asks a simple question like, why do you do this? Or why do I have to do it this way? I think you can imagine the response that you're likely to get, because this is the way we do things here. Processes become taken for granted. Nobody questions their validity anymore. The fact that these rational myths are then widely shared strengthens the perceived reality, and individuals acting upon them presuppose that they have been given the right to do so. Next is the differentiation of validity context. The effectiveness of a rational myth is dependent on the structure and the context of the situation. Rationality criteria with which an action is supposed to align itself are not abstract, but bound to a demarcated context. Henceforth, the specification of a guiding idea must include a context for determining its validity. The degree to which behavior in a certain context is detached from another situation becomes an essential element of an institutionalized process. In other words, the institutionalization of a guiding idea is related to a social fragmentation of the real world. Now, you will agree that the university and government are completely different institutions. However, the differentiation of the validity context of the state and that of universities as an organ of state are becoming more and more blurry. National issues such as poverty, unemployment, and inequality are societal problems, and we can try to claim that it's outside our validity context, but it's the very same society that universities serve. That is why it might be very difficult for a leader or a manager to explain his or her behavior or decisions to someone that's in a different validity context. Take an example like insourcing or outsourcing. At another institution, like your church, your community group, you might be criticized for decisions that you actually support in your institution about outsourcing. And that is because the validity contexts of the environments are different. Next is the sanctioning power of institutions. Can universities develop their own rationality criteria? Do they have their own validity context? Very much so. And we can do that because we have a sanctioning power that enforces and defends our claim to legitimacy. The nature and extent of sanctions are crucial for universities. Universities maintain legitimacy because of the good track record of the employment of graduates. Today, there is still strong evidence that graduates have a lower unemployment rate and are likely to earn a higher salary than non-graduates. The state is likely to benefit from tax contributions as well as increased economic activity. So the fact that universities are still recognized as places of intellectual discovery has earned the university social as well as state recognition of its autonomy. And our sanctioning power is very dependent on how our legitimacy is perceived. Actions taken by a university are based on the applicable rationality criteria and will only deal with the problems that occur in the respective action context. Problems beyond these criteria tend to be externalized. So what institutions actually want to claim is that their actions are confined to their social context. This implies that an institution's action context is reduced. Our decisions are based on how it affects our institution in our context, and we externalized other contexts that might be influenced by our decisions. Externalization of contingencies can create very volatile situations for universities, as we must remember that a university fulfills many roles. The university is also an employer and an education agency. It's part of a healthcare, innovation, and a legal system. So the university is also an organization in the service of other institutions. So this framework provides a valuable perspective of how everyday practices become institutionalized. And the underlying argument here is that what we consider to be appropriate actions is based fundamentally on a shared social reality, which in turn is a human construction, created through social interaction and ongoing externalization. We now focus on how do we then deal with change at organizations that have a lot of these institutionalized practices. Universities must not only respond to pressing national needs, but we must also explore new realities and opportunities. In the 90s, a very different idea of higher education started emerging, one in which relevance, access, social inclusion, accountability seem to predominate, especially when we have high unemployment rates and more pressure to massify our higher education system. Having alluded to the institutionalized nature of a university and how historical practices have become embedded in universities, the next section focuses on a framework that is useful to classify change processes. And the framework I'm going to explain is the Kinevin Framework. This work draws heavily on the research done by Dave Snowden, and although I do not include all my references, these references are available at any time. Now, Kinevin is a Welsh word, and it means the place of your multiple belongings. In this very sense, you're rooted in many pasts, which profoundly influence what you are, but of which you can only be partially aware. The Kinevin Framework is a sense-making model and not a categorization model. And this difference is important. A classification model is a typical 2x2 matrix where the framework precedes the data. And you just take the data point and drop it into a box and you get an explanation of the category. But the danger is that you cannot see subtle differences until it is too late. So categorization is good for exploitation, but it's rather poor for exploration during periods of change. With sense-making, the data precedes the framework, and the framework emerges from the data during a process. So processes and change processes at a university can be divided into 4 quadrants: simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. In each of the setups, there are different leadership skills that must be applied to successfully navigate the situation. The simple or obvious domain is characterized by simple input and output. A simple input leads to a well-defined output. There's no ambiguity. These outputs are often characterized as best practice. But best practice is a term that is legitimate in this domain, but it might not be legitimate in the others. For example, if you need to process applications according to some set criteria, the staff member has to do just that. And any deviation from the norm should be minor and should easily be handled by the next level line manager. Now, of course, there are risks associated with this, and especially the rational myths that underpin these practices, because today's best practice is often tomorrow's challenge. In the complicated space, there needs to be some expert knowledge applied to the problem posed in order to arrive at a decision. We often refer to this as good practice, and there needs to be an interpretation of the problem before a decision can be made. It's not simply deciding which best practice is applied to each situation. An answer is definitely achievable in the complicated domain, but it will not necessarily be immediate obvious. Depends also very much on what experts or expertise you have available. And the challenge in the complicated domain is to reach decisions. There's a trade-off between finding the right answer and simply making a decision. So the time factor can become very crucial in the complicated domain. In the complex domain, you will find situations for which there are no clear, well-defined outcomes. The problem must be probed in order to ascertain the correct path forward. Every year, we need to finalize the budget, set tuition fees, create a vibrant student culture. These are all complex issues. Most situations and decisions in organizations are complex because some or other change introduce unpredictability and instability in other areas of the organization. And in this domain, we can often only understand why things happen in retrospect. Often when something happens, everyone will go, oh, that is why it happened. A and B resulted in C. But if you rewind the video and watch it again, you might get a different perspective. Rewind, play, get another perspective. The reason for this is, in the complex domain, it's all about a network of related things, and the relationships are non-linear. So a small activity somewhere in the network can have a big impact somewhere else. The sort of things you deal with in the complex domain is never completed and can include things, as I said, like culture, innovation, trust. And to deal with these issues, thinking they are simple or complicated will not get the desired results because you need different leadership tools and different skill sets to make sense. Cause and effect can only be deduced in retrospect, and often there are no right answers in the complex domain. There are best answers. In the chaotic domain, this is the area of unknown unknowns. The only objective in the chaotic arena is to remove oneself from this quadrant as quickly as possible. Leaders in this area are advised to make a decision and then try to move to another quadrant, any quadrant, from which a definite path can be taken forward. During Feast Must Fall, we quickly found ourselves in chaos. It actually hit us like a big wave. Universities deliver graduates, but due to slow economic growth, many graduates are unemployed. Due to the poor performance of the basic school system, we have a mismatch between skill supply and demand. The high unemployment rate and social inequality fueled the disappointment of students in government. The frustration turned into anger, and as an organ of state, universities became the outlet for students. Suddenly, our legitimacy was questioned, and many of our rational myths were challenged. The central space in the Kinevin Framework is called disorder. Disorder is if you don't know which space you are in, and that is where we find ourselves most of the time. This is a very big leadership challenge, as we all tend to interpret a situation according to our personal preference. But the danger is, if you have spent a few years in a bureaucratic environment, you tend to see every problem as a failure of process. If you're an expert in a certain domain, then any failure is blamed on not having enough time or resources to do an analysis, and you can fall into an analysis paralysis. So leaders assess problems according to their own preference or situation. Natural complex workers such as politicians, their reaction in any crisis is to get lots of people together from lots of different backgrounds with the frantic hopefulness that somebody will come up with a good solution. Now, the last thing I want to point out in the Kinevin framework is that the simple domain, the obvious domain, lies next to chaotic, and for a very good reason, because the most frequent collapse into chaos occur because success bred complacency, and we don't realize that a simple process can overnight become a crisis. People get complacent. They start believing in their own myths. You start believing that past success make you immune to failure. And then suddenly you fall over the edge from simple into a crisis. What this framework actually tells us is that depending on the space you are in, you should think differently and analyze differently. Okay, so we have now considered universities as well as a sense-making framework for analyzing change. Next, I want to focus on the importance of legitimacy. Now, at the heart of institutional change is the notion of maintaining legitimacy. Legitimacy simply refers to the acceptance of an organization by its leaders by stakeholders. It has been recognized that legitimacy in the long run subsists in the eye of the beholder. The legitimacy of leaders and that of an organization is closely related. There are many typologies of legitimacy, and I'm only going to highlight a few. Normative legitimacy is objective and achieved by meeting desirable standards. Empirical legitimacy is subjective and less value-laden. Empirical legitimacy is the recognition and justification of the right to exercise power and influence. Moral legitimacy is based on the extent to which institutions are perceived as operating according to firm moral and ethical standards. And moral or ethical legitimacy is bestowed when the actions of the university are consistent with social values. So moral legitimacy is based on judgments about what organizations should and should not do. On a personal level, it's established when a person's communication is perceived as honest and transparent, and when a manager acts in ways that are compatible with the stakeholders' moral and ethical values. Social legitimacy refers to the ethical responsibility of institutions to reveal or share information on social issues. And moral legitimacy is strengthened when institutions seem to defend and pursue socially accepted values. Social legitimacy is also enhanced when institutions express their concern about social issues. Pragmatic legitimacy occurs when stakeholders attain their objectives through an institution. Stakeholders receive something that holds value whilst putting certain obligations on the institution. So it's important to note that a fundamental difference between moral and pragmatic legitimacy is that moral legitimacy does not consider personal benefit, but rather focus on whether it's the right thing to do, whereas pragmatic legitimacy has a more selfish nuance, focusing on whether personal goals can be obtained through the institution. That is the extent to which the particular interest of a certain group of people are represented. So that is just a very brief glimpse of the different legitimacy types that come into play and together informs the legitimacy of a leader and of an institution. That brings us to sense-making. Sense-making can involve from a few individuals up to a larger number of people. Thus, you can have this spectrum with individual cognition on the one end and a social discursive process informed by a larger group of people on the other. During my research, I worked across the spectrum. Now, sense-making involves much more than just sitting and thinking about what just happened. Sense-making is an ongoing retrospective cognitive process of organizing and rationalizing what people are doing. And sense-making can lead to insights that inform your future behavior. The way groups and individuals think about sense-making of their world in a crisis is central to the understanding of how change occurs. Now, sense-making allowed me to reflect on how did all public universities in South Africa moved from this picture of what we call a healthy, diverse and vibrant student life to a picture like this in less than 10 days. And how did leaders respond to this? So through sense making, in my research, circumstances were unpacked, interpreted, and turned into some form of meaning. It is important to remember that sense making is about the interplay of action and interpretation, rather than. It is important to remember that sense making is about the interplay of action and interpretation rather than the influence of evaluation of choice. Hence, the attribution falls on the compelling situational factors and contextual features that influence these actions. So it does not focus on individual leaders or trying to criticize any decisions that were taken. The focus is not on judging any decisions, but rather making retrospective sense of what happened and how did leaders maintain legitimacy. So this is the research scene. We have the context, we have the sense-making framework, the challenges we have to confront, and we also today have the hindsight of what happened. So ultimately, sense-making is intrinsically related to legitimacy, as it deals with plausibility and the continued redrafting of an emerging story so that it becomes more comprehensive, incorporate more data, and decisions can become more resilient in the face of criticism. It is critical that managers must create opportunities for sense-making, because the essence of sense-making is the interpretation of information and the construction of meaning. So colleagues, I'll take off. I do not want to provide a laundry list of good leadership skills, but rather an understanding of specific factors that enhanced or negated leadership legitimacy during this change process. And I have some quotes from interviews to inform the findings. The first thing that became apparent is leadership legitimacy is enhanced if a leader can manage to get the change process out of chaos. The stress associated with decision-making was more than one would expect from steering a change process due to the volatility of the situation, the unpreparedness of senior managers to deal with the situation, and the potential risks associated with violent student protest. The volatile nature of the change process made it extremely difficult for university managers to focus on the core business. To try and get stability on campuses, negotiated agreements were reached that would not have been agreed to in normal conditions. But looking back now, one can understand that trying to treat the situation as if this was a complex or a complicated situation would not have yielded any other results. One respondent said, you know, at the time, what was common sense was not common. Things did not make sense. The whole environment was polluted. Reasoning was not the order of the day. University autonomy is built on the rationality criteria of scientific discovery and a methodological way of dealing with a problem. Now, suddenly, this methodological way of dealing with a problem had to give way to unexpected political battles and multifaceted demands. Leaders that succeeded in transforming the decision-making platforms from chaos to complexity and could convince people why it was so necessary and urgent to do that enjoyed more legitimacy. The need to make decisions under pressure with insufficient time to consider the multiplicity of intended and unintended consequences led to perceptions of poor decision-making. But where senior managers succeeded in acting sincerely upon the collective advice of other colleagues, legitimacy seemed to be better retained from a staff perspective. Not doing this resulted in a loss of legitimacy. It became very clear that staff wanted to be heard. Many university leaders, amid a crisis, neglect to listen to the voice of university staff or to create platforms for internal dialogue. Leadership legitimacy was higher, where leaders established a number of working teams and without being too prescriptive, and then trusting these teams. So working with teams with a proper mandate seemed to be the best vehicle to respond to radical change. An important factor was the fit between the working teams and the demands of the task, and the value of diverse teams came to the fore. When team members think and act alike, creativity diminishes, adjustment to change is compromised, and groups stagnated. Diversity increased the effectiveness of team performance. One respondent said, "The creativity that comes from working through different points of view on a complex problem was very useful." Leadership legitimacy was strong, where leaders did not dictate the way to proceed, but rather focused on identifying the conditions that would increase the likelihood that the management team will take collective ownership and use their various strengths to mitigate risks. So, effective leaders do not dictate, but create conducive platforms. Due to the national nature of the fee protests, perceptions were not based on a single institution. The distinction between dealing with local versus national issues became blurry. Decisions taken at a university impacted not only the university, but also other universities. External stakeholders that did not have direct interactions with universities relied on secondary information of what was happening at universities to make their own legitimacy judgments. So trust relations are based on the expectations that the actions of management capture the best interest of the other stakeholders. And trust can be seen as the extent to which management meet the expectation of staff, students, and other stakeholders. Failure to do this negates legitimacy. As one senior manager said, "I experience it as a personal dilemma or internal conflict when command and control began to dominate as opposed to care and co-create. If that is not there anymore, I do not want to work there any longer." Leadership legitimacy is enhanced when leaders communicate often and truthful. During Feast Must Fall, a breakdown in communication occurred at a number of universities. Firstly, meetings were obstructed, and that reduced opportunities for productive negotiations and feedback. Secondly, officials did not seem to use social media communication in crises, while students made extensive use of social media. The absence of clear communication exacerbated negative feelings during the change period. Thirdly, the breakdown in communication became evident through conflicting messages that senior managers and students who attended the same meeting, or the fact that resolutions taken during a meeting were not honored by student leaders. Senior leaders that communicated often and truthful, even about failed negotiations and uncertainty, retained better leadership legitimacy. As one respondent said, "Honesty, even if it's bad news, gains my respect." Staff perceptions on the frequency of the leader's accuracy about the facts associated with change positively related to subordinates' perception of the success of the change. The ability to speak openly about one's own and others' emotions, and the ability to contextualize what was happening, strengthened leadership legitimacy. So it's better to describe the change process through personal narratives rather than numerical facts. Leaders had to do whatever was necessary to keep the academic project running. Some of these measures, unfamiliar to university staff, coupled with poor communication and crisis decision-making, portrayed universities as non-caring institutions. The bringing of private security onto campuses that are associated with open spaces was seen as compromising the very notion of a university. Of course, many people had inner conflict about the whole issue of free education and the manner in which it happened. While students and staff could express their feelings, many senior managers felt that their leadership role required the suppression of emotions in public. But emotions matter. Where personal narratives were not provided, staff members drew their own conclusion. And as one person said, "I was left with the impression that buildings are more important than people." So leadership legitimacy is enhanced when personal narratives are used to contextualize decisions. Chaos and innovation can be managed in parallel. Leaders who succeeded in managing chaos and innovation in parallel enjoyed more leadership legitimacy. Any unplanned change creates the perfect storm to consider other critical changes. A crisis forces senior managers to think differently about administration and the teaching environment. And leadership legitimacy is strengthened when leaders recognize this and create platforms where these ideas can be taken forward and actually create a sense of excitement about future possibilities. It creates a shift in focus from immediate problems to future possibilities. As one respondent said, when the music changes, so does the dance. I think higher education is fundamentally a different space, but I think people are still struggling to understand that the dance has changed and what is now required of us. So this requires a leadership focus on multiple issues. One, on dealing with crisis management to resolve immediate issues, coupled with a strategic focus on exploring how things can be done differently. If you wait until the crisis is over, the opportunity will be lost. Legitimate leaders expose rational myths. The loss of normative and empirical legitimacy made it almost impossible to sustain leadership legitimacy. Funding problems were portrayed as a tension between vice-chancellors and students, whilst the findings on the underlying reasons for the radical change indicated that many of the decisions fell outside the mandate of university managers. But Plessis, in the book I referred to earlier, pointed to the complexity of the dual role of managers. Managers who are co-creators of the institutionalized system, but must also fulfill the role of change agents, where they need to question the very same rational myths they are part of. So leadership legitimacy is strengthened, not when leaders provide the right answers, but when they ask the right questions. Linking this to the Kinevin Framework, by asking the right questions, one can avoid moving from a simple process the one day to finding yourself in a crisis the next. Leadership legitimacy is strengthened through legitimate engagements. The reason, therefore, is a leader's engagement legitimizes those they engage with. Distrust about the legitimacy of the various stakeholders clouded the dialogues. Many examples are cited where groups of students would demand engagements with leadership, and yet these students did not have a clear mandate or authority to represent the students. And as such, their legitimacy as a structure was questionable. Furthermore, smaller groups of students emerged with their own sets of demands, disregarding established university processes on how to deal with these issues. Leaders who managed to steer these discussions in such a way that recognized structures became involved or succeeded in exposing illegitimate structures seemed to maintain better legitimacy. The last point that came out very strongly was legitimate leaders understand what motivates their staff. The way we understand and interpret an event influences both our responses and managerial actions. To make sense of legitimacy during radical change, it is so important to contextualize the personal values that guide leadership behavior. Honesty and respect were highlighted as two core prerequisites for successful senior leadership. Someone said, what will make me stay is the belief that I can influence change. When I sign a performance agreement, I sign it with myself. And when I evaluate my performance, I'm very critical about myself. A critical dimension of emotional intelligence includes the ability to read and interpret others in a social context, to detect nuances and emotional reaction. So emotional intelligence is increasingly being seen as a requirement for effective leadership and driving performance. This study has confirmed that the institutional space, emotional security, and psychological well-being of its staff are inseparable. It became clear that a lack of leadership legitimacy can result in distrust, low staff morale, and disengagement of staff. To conclude, in my thesis, I developed a conceptual framework of sense-making of legitimacy. And today, I only focused on one aspect of the findings, and that is leadership legitimacy. We also see that the lines between personal legitimacy of a senior manager and the institutional legitimacy of the university are interwoven. And I want to conclude with the words of one of the respondents who summarized a leadership role so well, in my view. And this person said, "For me, it's important to have time to do my work, not only do it, but to do it properly. When we go to a work situation, we say that I want to earn a living so that I can survive and take care of my family. But you join a new family. You don't realize that you are signing up for a bigger thing that you can understand. You start making relationships and you start understanding that it's a myriad of systems and complex issues, feelings, and emotions that you have to manage." What I have learned is that leadership legitimacy is a lifetime journey, not a quick trip. And the value of sense-making during leadership legitimacy is a very important part of the development process. So thank you, colleagues, for indulging me in this session.